Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We're so excited to have you here. We are very excited to bring to you this program that responds in the end to the signals you gave us. So before we get started, I wanted to first thank our sponsors, Folgers, Dunkin', and DCP, and Keurig Dr. Pepper have very graciously contributed to the work that we do, along with our broad membership of more than 200 companies that seek to come together to advance the work that we do in this space. So what I wanted to offer was this program of global leadership is in response to our global consultation last year. Many of you will remember that we undertook a survey in close collaboration with trade associations around the world to really hear from the community, what are the topics that matter to you, and what do you want to learn more about? And so we're bringing to you today one of the topics that came out loud and clear in that program, or that consultation, around farmer profitability. The point of this session is really to serve as a bridge, bringing researchers and academics who are really deeply engaged in this work, not just in coffee, but in many other domains of commodities and economies and supply chains, to really bring their expertise and knowledge to the specific questions we have, and bridging them with industry-generated data led by Enveritas, which is a really rich data set that we have in our industry that helps us better understand empirically from the ground up what's really going on with farmers. And so we brought these communities together, the Enveritas group and Dr. Macchiavello and Dr. Del Prete, to really dive into this work. It's a preliminary exploration. This is by no means a finished product. We feel this is the first in a conversation to go forward. And what I'd like to do is really challenge all of you in the audience and those who are listening to think about how you would use this information. How does this information and this empirical evidence of what's really happening challenge your assumptions? And how does that maybe change the way governments are acting, the policies that are being developed, financing institutions are making decisions, as well as obviously programs at origin that many roasters in the trade have been contributing to, as well as co-ops really trying to improve the services for their members. So we really hope to bring these data to you as a beginning of a conversation, and we'll be wrapping it up with Rick Reinhardt, who will really help us synthesize this and move it forward and explain how IDH sees this kind of work going forward. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Today we'll be hearing from Karl Servon, who will be presenting the data, Dr. Maria Berkowitz, who will be giving us a deeper dive into the analysis that she's conducted with the Enveritas data, as well as the project that Dr. Macchiavello and Dr. Del Prete have been working on over the last year with us as a group to really dive into the data and bring us something really new and different insights that we're very excited to share with you all today. So we really encourage you all to ask questions. The point of this is to bring these minds to you, the audience, to really have an opportunity to ask questions, interrogate assumptions, and help us think differently about these data and this situation and how we can approach this differently. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Karl, and he'll kick us off.
Sorry, I think I'm live now, right? Let me begin again. So thank you very much, Vern, for the introduction. My name is Karl Servon. I'm the co-founder and chief operating officer of Enveritas. I'm just going to give a pretty quick introduction of the work that Enveritas has been doing, an overview of our process for collecting and analyzing coffee farm data. And then through the rest of the session, we'll see some applications of that. As Vern mentioned, my colleague Maria, one of our data analysts, will also share some preliminary analysis that she's doing on cost of production and farm profitability. So first off, just who is Enveritas? We're a nonprofit organization founded in 2016 with a mission of ending poverty in the coffee sector by the year 2030. We work with buyers, producers, and other partners, including World Coffee Research, to assess sustainability conditions and to use the data that we see as a force for good. Our work really begins with building and maintaining a global base map of coffee communities. So each year, we try to make improvements to this base map. We try to cover more countries, more regions, and have better estimates of how many farmers there are and how much coffee they produce. This year, we're hoping to work in 25 countries and over 500 regions, covering nearly half of the world's coffee farmer population and 2/3 of the world's coffee production. Now, when I speak about coverage, what do I mean? We don't actually go out and visit every farm. What we do is randomized sampling. And more specifically, we use machine learning to identify the properties of coffee farms from satellite imagery. And then we take a robust sample of farms, pins as we call them, from the possible set of locations. We assign those pins to local teams of enumerators, and they will be there in harvest, trained, and travel by motorbike to the farms on their list and check in. Once there, they speak to farmers, workers, and make observations about the environment. Participation is voluntary, it's anonymous, and confidential for farmers. Each year, we visit about 50,000 farms in this way. And by geo-randomizing, rather than using a list as a source of farms to visit, we can better ensure that we have a representative sample of actual growers. We visit farms with less than a quarter of a hectare, very small farms, as well as much larger farms, even those with mechanized operations. Now, one of the distinct differences about Enveritas is that we spend a lot of effort in analyzing the data as it comes in real time. One of the challenges when it comes to data collection is oftentimes you might author a survey and then go out and use it, and you don't start analyzing it until it comes in. And in that case, if there's any challenge or bias in your data, you don't discover it until after you've completed your collection. In our case, we built a system where we're able to give our enumerators daily feedback on the quality of data that's coming in. Outliers that are spotted are detected algorithmically, and they're given that feedback on a daily basis. If a survey doesn't meet our data quality standards, it won't be accepted. In addition to this, we backcheck about 5 to 10% of our accepted surveys each year in every community. And so that helps us ensure best as possible that our data is going to be consistent over time in geography. But finally, the last thing we do is use the data to make a codified assessment of various sustainability issues. Now, these assessments, obviously, they incorporate our on-the-ground observations, but they also look at local laws, international treaties, as well as external data sets, like ones about coffee prices, maps of protected areas, and many more. Again, our overall goal is to use data as a force for good, and we want to help the sector answer difficult questions and ultimately drive funding and resources to the communities and issues where it can have the most impact. Hopefully today you'll see a number of examples of that and some of that potential on today's webinar. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleague Maria, who's going to share a sample application of the data and the type of modeling that can be done on top of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Hello, everyone. I would like to take a couple of minutes to present an analysis related to cost of production modeling. So, cost of production model. This graph shows a structure of the cost of production model, the first approach to the modeling, which has been tested in 5 countries by now. In this first approach, we decided to focus on 4 factors influencing the cost of production. And these are labor, where we look at harvest, spraying, and weeding labor, inputs, where we focus on organic and inorganic fertilizers, and pest and disease and weeds chemicals, processing cost, which depends on the form in which coffee is sold by the farmer, and cost of having a loan. Obviously, this is not a full list of variables which can be used in the cost of production modeling, but these were the ones that we decided to focus on in this first approach because these are the most commonly used in the literature. In the modeling, we use our survey data for the variables we have data for, along with assumptions based on deep research and lots of conversation with our teams in the countries for the variables we don't have data for. The model, along with this data and assumptions, allow us to obtain distribution of cost of production at a farm level. This allows us then to estimate cost of production for different profiles of farms. Here in this example, we see distribution of cost of production per hectare. It's the graph on the left side of this page. And distribution of cost of production per pound of green bean. It's the graph on the right side of the page. For 2 groups of farmers we were interested in. So the first group of farmers, group A, these are farmers having lower yield and not receiving higher price for coffee quality. And the second group, group B, these are farmers having higher yield and also receiving higher price for coffee quality. When we look at the distribution of cost per hectare, and we focus on the group B farmers, so the farmers having higher yield and receiving higher price for quality, we can see that their distribution is shifted to the right. It's shifted to the higher values of cost of production. That means that they simply have higher cost of production if we look at the cost of production per hectare. This can be explained by more investment to achieve higher yields and also ensuring higher coffee quality. On the other hand, when we look at the distribution of cost of production per pound of green bean, we can see that their distribution is more steep, it's more narrow, it's more centered around the average values. And if we compare the average cost of production between the groups, we will see that these farmers have lower cost of production per pound of green bean. So although they have higher cost per hectare, at the same time they achieve lower cost of production per pound. We are currently focusing on validating and further improvements of the model. To validate the model, we research other studies that focus on cost of production modeling. This table summarizes some of the main papers we had a chance to look into. They vary by variables used in the modeling, by the scope, by the country, and also by the methodology. What is important here to note is that if we look at the variables list, some of the models include family labor in the estimation of cost of production, and some of the models don't include that. Also, the same is related to machine depreciation and trees depreciation. Some of the models include that in the estimation and some don't. One of the papers that I found really interesting in the validation process was a paper from 2013 by Echeverria. One of the validation methods was to compare the relationships between 4 variables described by Echeverria with the relationships between the same variables based on our current model. And this page shows the results of this analysis. So on the left side of this page, we see Echeverria's findings, and on the right side of this page, we see the replication of this analysis based on our modeling. The way we look at this page is we compare the corresponding charts, and in this example, we compare the relationships between cost per kilogram and yield coming from the 2 studies. What we see is that the Enveritas model predicts similar findings to Echeverria's paper. In this presentation, I don't want to go through entire validation process, but I would like to share one interesting finding, which starts just here. So if we zoom this picture a little bit and have a closer look at the relations between variables where yield is the independent variable, this is what we would see. So the bigger graphs are coming from the Enveritas model, and the smaller plots on the sides come from the Echeverria paper. 2 things are to be noted. One, that the 2 models align really well. And the second is that the graph showing the relationship between yield and profitability is really interesting. So let's zoom that picture a little bit again, and let's focus on this graph showing the relationship between yield and profitability. This graph is built based on Guatemala data, and it's showing a relationship between yield and profitability here is measured as relation of price and cost. So on the y-axis, everything above 1 means that price was higher than the cost, and everything below 1 means that the price of coffee was lower than the cost of producing that coffee, which means that farmers were producing this coffee at loss. Looking at this relationship, we see that with the increase of yield, profitability increases, what we would expect, but only to some extent. There is a certain point, a certain level of yield. Here in this example, it's somewhere around 700 kilograms per hectare, where the relationship flattens, where further increases of yield doesn't necessarily increases the profitability. The question arises, what are the differences between farmers who, having similar level of yield, earn profit or not earn profit at the same time? So what is the difference between farmers in group 1 and 2 on this chart and farmers in groups 3 and 4? This table summarizes some of the characteristics of farmers in group 1 and 2 that allows us to compare those farmers. If we look at this table, we can clearly see that farmers from group 2, so those who earn profit, are having significantly lower cost of production per pound of green bean. And at the same time, they also have significantly lower fertilizer use. So lower fertilizer use drives the cost down and at the same time allows the farmers to gain profit because the cost is lower. So for many, ineffective use of fertilizer is a problem. It adds cost, but doesn't lead to higher yield or profit. Obviously, this is not a final conclusion. This is more like an opening door for further investigation and research, but definitely an interesting finding to share. The other preliminary findings that we got from the first approach to the modeling, these are that cost of production varies greatly among farms and that there is no single cost of production for a country. The second is that harvesting labor and fertilizer use appear as the biggest drivers of cost of production in countries that we analyzed so far. Also, cost of production strongly impacts farmers' profitability. Farmers who invest more in coffee have higher cost per hectare, but at the same time tend to have lower cost per pound of green bean. And last but not least, yield is not always correlated with higher profitability. Thank you very much for your attention.
So much, Maria. And I wanted to give a quick moment for Carl to jump in and just offer a brief response to the questions that Martin asked, just because the data that are being used are part of Rocco's study. So I think it will be helpful, Carl, if you could just clarify some of the points that Martin has raised, and then we can proceed to Rocco.
Sure, I'm just reading the questions right now. Hello, Martin. The first one around cost production models are all for Arabica farmers. So as Maria mentioned, we're looking to develop this, test this on a few countries, and then if it starts yielding useful results, expand it to others. So the 4 or 5 countries that she mentioned, I think right now are all in Latin America. I believe Indonesia is included, but of course there's the possibility of expanding it to other Arabic origins and extending it to Robusta. Obviously, there's a lot of different practices in different countries, and so things may need to be adjusted in order for it to yield consistent results in each place. So that's the first question. When it comes to other cost of production studies, yes, as Maria said, a key goal here is being able to validate the results here and to compare them to the results that are produced by other models. So that's incredibly valuable. And where those cost production studies exist, we'll try to look at how they're making their assumptions and where there are differences between the ones that Maria is using and what others have done. In the case of, I think, Eugene's question here about Colombia, so Colombia is one of the countries where we did have a robust starting point. I think the examples that Maria showed, however, are from Guatemala. But again, this model has been extended now to 5 countries. And so if there are specific questions about how it performs or the insights that it surfaces for individual countries, we can take that perhaps after the webinar, or we can reach out separately.
Thank you, Carl. So I'd like now to turn the mic over to Dr. Davide Del Prete, who will be presenting the results of the model that he and Dr. Machiavello have worked on. Over to you, Davide.
Can you hear me? Okay. It seems so.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Vern, and thank you again for the opportunity to present the preliminary results of this study to this audience. This is actually a joint work with Professor Rocco Machiavello here, in which we provide basically a preliminary assessment of the differences in coffee yields around the globe, actually, and a very basic quantification exercise in which we analyze the potential gains from reducing this dispersion in yields along different dimensions. Okay, so we really would like to inform the audience and the sector stakeholders on these findings, as well as to get feedback from you, which will help us in defining and refining basically our future research questions. So why studying yields heterogeneity? So we believe that studying heterogeneity of productivity is of particular importance, as agricultural productivity differences have been found to explain most of the cross-country income differences. Okay, so a precise measure of the productivity gaps, both between agriculture and other sectors, but also within agricultural crops, and of course, a deep understanding of the sources and drivers of these gaps is a very important question. So this map actually shows the aggregate yield heterogeneity for 17 crops worldwide, but coffee. And indeed, we didn't have so far a sufficient good understanding of the global coffee productivity dispersion. And we studied this. And to what extent productivity gaps are so also existent in the coffee sector, and if so, where do they come from? And lastly, as anticipated, we provide a quantification of the potential gains from reducing the dispersion in yields. In other words, we posed the following question: how large gains would be if we were able to increase yields of the worst performing farmers? So, as anticipated, aim of this presentation is to provide a first assessment of the global coffee production heterogeneity along various dimensions, including gender and age, and basically to analyze the effects of the potential reallocation. The main source of data, of course, are these very rich coffee farmer surveys conducted by the Enveritas, and we use so far a sample of 11 coffee producing countries for more than 80,000 farmers in 2018 and 2019. However, we are currently working and collaborating with the Veritas team to get more data and actually to increase basically the number of countries we are analyzing and the years. Okay, and as shown, basically these surveys collect very detailed georeferenced information on coffee farmers, including farm gate prices, quantities, type of coffee, sizes, ownership, and age. And so we are able to compare agriculture, coffee productivity gaps within the same sector across 3 continents over more years. Okay, very briefly, this is the outline of the talk. I will discuss about the productivity dispersion in the coffee sector. Then we will analyze this dispersion through the lenses of the gender and age dimensions. And finally, we will see what will happen to prices if we were able to increase yields. Okay. So we measure farming productivity as yields and actually show that there is indeed significant productivity dispersion across and within countries. And on average, actually, Ethiopia turns out to be the worst performing country in terms of productivity, and Vietnam the best one. Okay. And focusing on these two countries, which we know actually are very diverse, Ethiopia produces Melia Arabica, Vietnam Robusta. So, and there are also many other differences between these countries. We show the kernel densities and the underlying distribution in deciles in 10 bins in the top panels. And at the bottom, you see the maps by region, okay? So here we really want to highlight the fact that even within countries that are so different, there is actually huge heterogeneity in terms of yields, okay? And so based on this evidence, we conduct a very first basic accounting exercise, whereby we analyze basically what would be the effects on aggregate yields if you were able to bring the productivity level of the worst performing farmers to the level of the median farmer or to the level of the best farmers, okay? We do so by splitting the productivity distribution in each country and in each region by deciles, okay? And actually we find that reallocating the low performing farmers that are those in the first decile to the productivity of the median farmer within a specific region, the average yields would increase by 6% nationwide, of course, with some degree of heterogeneity across countries, as shown by the green diamonds that you see in the figure. And we said we'll get a 20% increase, 26% increase, sorry, in aggregate yields if instead we were able to bring the worst farmers to the productivity of the best, that is the top decile, okay, the 10 decile farmers that are represented by these yellow diamonds, okay? Just for you to know, these are not really negligible gains, negligible effects, considering that we are kind of reallocating or treating only 10% of the farmer population by country. And as expected, there is also evidence of large heterogeneity within each region, okay? In this figure, each dot represents the productivity gains of the reallocation from the bottom decile to the median decile in a specific region by country. Next, we analyze whether and how these results are also related to the gender and age dimensions, okay? In terms of gender, we first show that the share of women owning a coffee plantation, so we are talking about coffee owners, okay, is very diverse. It ranges from 4%, about 4% in Brazil, up to 42% in Rwanda. These female producers are on average relatively slightly less productive than their male counterparts in each country. And so in an exercise that is very much similar to what has been previously discussed, here we consider the effect of narrowing the gaps within the female group, okay, against the gains or the effects from narrowing the gaps across groups, that is closing, in other words, the gender gaps, okay? And we find that actually bringing low performing female farmers to the female median productivity level within a country, the average aggregate yields would increase by 1%, the green dots that you see in the picture in the figure, or by 7% if you consider the top female farmers. While closing the gender gaps of these worst female farmers by country would only increase average yields by 0.06%, the blue diamonds, okay? Again, I'd like to recall here that closing the gender gap for us means bringing these worst female farmers to the same productivity level of their males counterparts, that is the worst male farmers in a country. And in the conclusion, actually, Rocco will provide some suggestion on how to interpret these results and some also policy implication of this. We then analyze the age dimension, first showing the coffee owners' age share by country, okay? And we found that even accounting for the demographics, the demographic pyramids in each country, Latin American countries are the oldest, and East African countries, and Ethiopia in particular, are the youngest countries. And when relating these to yields, we found a sort of bell-shaped relationship that is divided by age cohorts. This graph shows that the best performing group is that composed by individuals between 30 and 45, 30, 50 years, okay? While very young and old producers, coffee owners to be specific, have a lower performance. So very similar to what has been done before, we compare the effect again of narrowing the gaps within the group, the age group, against the gains from narrowing gaps across groups, and bringing the low-performing old farmers, those with more than 45 years, to the median productivity level within a country, the average yields will increase by 3%. Instead, closing the age gap, that is bringing the old farmers to the level of the young, okay, by country and by decile, so for the first decile of farmers, average yields will increase by only 0.08%, okay? And finally, as a last dimension, we consider size and yields. As you well know, actually, Brazilian farms are by far the largest, although even in these dimensions, there is very high degree of heterogeneity. And when study the relationship with yields, we show basically different slopes of the curves by different areas. So while, for instance, in Latin American countries, the largest farmers are also those with higher yields, as shown by the positive orange line, in Africa, we find an opposite result. Okay, all in all, I'd like to recall here that this relationship is actually the one that suffered the most by some of the productivity measurement issues that we discuss in appendix at length. So this requires, of course, further analysis, which is left for future work. And finally, we estimate what would be the effects of these raising yields on farm gate prices, okay? And to do so, we really need to estimate a very basic demand supply model, okay? And to trace out the demand curve, we should use a kind of exogenous shocks in the supply curve, okay? So this is done in a so-called instrumental variable approach. That is, we predict yields, that is the supply of this model, from very detailed weather data from a 9 months period before the day of the interview from Enveritas, and that is the weather data provide these exogenous shocks, okay, and use these predictions in a second stage of the model to estimate prices. So we build a machine learning ensemble model for this first stage, that is the prediction on yields from weather characteristics, which compared to a more standard traditional OLS model, such as the one that is being used by the Columbia Center for Sustainable Development in a recent report, if I remember correctly, in 2018 or 19. So this machine learning model actually tend to perform relatively better. And this is shown by the lower dispersion of the residuals that you see in the bottom panels, okay? So this model leads us in estimating a 10% increase in yields to reduce farm gate prices by about 0.2%. Okay, and this is confirmed even if we consider prices at a broader level, that is at the weather station level, for which we actually collect this weather data, or more broader, again, at the regional level. Okay, and with this, I leave the floor to Rocco to discuss conclusions and some policy implications. Thanks.
Yes. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thanks, Vern and Anna, for the invitation, and thanks to Carl and the rest of the Enveritas team to, allow us to develop or begin this collaboration. And thanks, Davide, for presenting these results, which, as Davide has mentioned, are still preliminary. I think, however, just to summarize, there are three main insights that have come up from this kind of initial exploration of the data. The first one is that there is a lot of heterogeneity within countries as well. Within each country, there is a lot of heterogeneity. That means that there are very high performers within each country. And that suggests that if we were to find ways of move the guys that are the worst performer within each country to what the median guy does, the median farmer does in that country, or even the best farmers do in that country, there will be enormous gains. So the aggregate gains will be very significant from this type of reallocation. And I think that these insights, or this lens, if you like, of looking at things, so considering heterogeneity within countries, I think has a practical implication. So let me give an example, the gender dimension that Davide mentioned. Obviously, closing gender gaps remains a primary goal, and I think is an objective that is worth pursuing, maybe even regardless of economic arguments. However, we know that gender gaps, both in terms of participation in the coffee sector as well as yields, tend to very strongly correlate with the social norms that are very deeply ingrained in the culture of the regions we are studying. And so considering this heterogeneity suggests, however, that the difference between the best performing women and the worst performing women in terms of yields, but I think the analysis would extend to profitability as well, within a given countries are actually orders of magnitude larger than the gender gaps that we observe. And so it might be possible to focus on programs that really try to improve the lot of the yields of the worst performing women, bring them to the yields of the typical women in the country, and that already would basically more than close the gender gap. There are, of course, other kind of practical, I think, implication of thinking about heterogeneity. Another implication, of course, is that as at least in an accounting sense, as Davide was mentioning, if we were able to even just upgrade the worst performing farmers to the level of the median farmers, we would have a very large aggregate increase in yields. And therefore, a question is, but aren't farmers going to be left worse off if this large increase in aggregate yields translate into lower prices? And it looks like when you try to do things, a little bit more carefully, or or not naively, so to speak, so using this model to predict yield and kind of exogenous variation in yield, what you see is actually that would probably not be the case, at least for farm gate prices in the vast majority of producing countries and origins. And so, in other words, here the recommendation is, yes, I think we can focus on improving yields without worrying, at least in the short run, too much about prices for farmers collapsing. At least that's definitely the case if we are considering countries like in East Africa or countries like in Central America that are not major producers. Okay, with these three insights, I'd like, however, to point out that this picture, if you like, that we have drawn of the coffee sector lies on a canvas that is the canvas of structural transformation. So one thing that we know about the development process is that, at least in an accounting sense, it is very strongly correlated with the idea of people moving out of agriculture. So the figures here show on the x-axis the income per capita across about 80 different countries, and then on the vertical axis, the share of people that are employed in agriculture. And as you can see, the process of development, either because of pull forces or because of push forces, but the process of development is basically associated with people moving out of agriculture. And I think that when we pair this observation with the observation about heterogeneity, we might start to think a little bit about some of the programs that we are doing in the context of coffee to support the income of the more disadvantaged farmers slightly differently. For instance, one question that I'd like to pose to the audience, and certainly one that I'll be interested in reflecting more as more data come in and as we can do more analysis, is should we subsidize people or jobs? So Concretely, there's been recent debates around the living income, which I think is a great tool that aims to provide a net income necessary to afford a decent standard of living in a specific place. Of course, the fact that there are these big heterogeneity in cost and yields already suggests that kind of computing that number is not going to be straightforward. But leaving aside this type of measurement challenges, I think that this lens of heterogeneity kind of raises the question of whether that's an appropriate approach. Because one way to think about the living income is essentially subsidizing a job. Because what you're doing is that you want to subsidize the most disadvantaged farmers, and the subsidy is conditional on the most disadvantaged farmers, the ones that are struggling more in a way, continuing to do what they are struggling to do. Maybe if we thought in terms of subsidizing people, we would come up with a different schemes where you would try to subsidize the same people that are struggling, because that's where poverty is. But you might want to remove the conditionality. That is, you might want to subsidizing them regardless of whether they keep doing coffee or cocoa, and instead try to focus on reallocating some of their land to farmers that are struggling less, at least in terms of achieving yields. As I mentioned, this is just a question, and it's more sort of a thought-provoking question than really a statement about what we should be doing. But thank you so much. Let me hand it over to Fern.
I wanted to invite Carl to come in to offer his insights as well. So Professor Doug Gollin has come in with a question really building on this point about living income, subsidizing people or jobs. And just for those, I'll read it for everyone. It's not uncommon in any industry to find that there is heterogeneity of both productivity and profitability, not the same thing, across firms or farms. You could either focus on helping the lowest productivity firms to get more productive, or you could ask whether it might be more beneficial to help them transition into other opportunities. Should we be trying to transform unproductive coffee farms into more productive coffee farms, or should we perhaps be encouraging them to look for other opportunities that they can pursue more effectively? Should we be trying to keep young people in coffee farming, or just trying to help young people find the best economic opportunities, which might involve, say, getting education and taking jobs off farm? So I wanted to open that back up to Enveritas, because I think you all think about this question deeply, and I thought, let's bring you into that conversation with Rocco.
Sure. No, thank you, Vern, and thank you, Doug, for the question. I think that is one of the most challenging questions that people in coffee face right now. And your observations are correct. There are many farmers who don't rely on coffee as a primary source of income, and they're not going to be as responsive towards efforts that are intended just to focus on coffee. At the same time, many people who are growing coffee aren't doing it by choice. It wasn't as if they looked at a set of opportunities and decided to grow coffee while comparing other ones. In many cases, people have inherited their farms, or it's been in the family for generations. So I think these are some of the most difficult questions to answer right now. It is going to depend a lot on local policy, opportunities which exist, and the support structure that's created for farmers to transition. It's difficult to establish coffee. It's also extremely difficult to exit coffee. It takes money to literally take trees out of a farm and convert it to something else. And in many parts of the world, there aren't good alternatives that can provide the same level of income as coffee. So I don't think there's any quick or one-size-fits-all solutions. I do think this is one of the biggest challenges that the industry needs to grapple with, especially at this time where we're undergoing some kind of a generational transition in many places where parents might be retiring and their children might not be living in rural areas and might be questioning what to do with the farm once it passes hands.
Wonderful, thank you for that. And I guess going back to this broader question, a number of people have raised the question about family labor. And when we think about not only the specifics, the transition in the structural transformation as workers look off farm, but within the farm, that transition from a lower productivity farm to maybe the fifth decile, where you have a lot of family labor at the outside and perhaps hired labor, as you move up the income spectrum as a coffee farmer. How do you see the inclusion of this integration of the cost of family labor or calculating family labor into these estimates? Carl, would you be able to handle that? And Maria, and then Rocco and Davide?
Yeah, so as Maria showed, this is one of the big differences among models, is that some give value to family labor, some value it the same as going into the labor force and paying a kind of minimum wage or the wage for that activity. Others completely exclude it because there is no cash value associated with it. So our model is agnostic about this. We're able to use it as a variable either way. I think that what you see, however, is that it is in most cases not a fair comparison to say this is what that labor would be worth on the open market, because there's a lot of dynamics about coffee labor that make the time that people spend not as transferable. An example of this is the labor that that families might spend turning coffee while it is drying at the home wet mill. So this is the type of activity where it may not require 8 hours of consistent work over the course of the day, but it might be something where you're doing this every 15 minutes, every 20 minutes, every 2 hours. And so that is a type of work which is considerable for families and for people to do, but is not really fungible. It's very difficult to take someone and have them provide just that function on the farm. And at the same time, it's difficult for family members to use those little chunks of 15, 20 minutes and go out and find a job that offers a similar wage as the time they were spending there. So again, we have the ability to look at this either way. I think Maria can share some examples of how the model performs with that explicitly factored in, with it discounted, and with it removed. Anything you'd like to add, Maria, to that point?
Yes, thank you, Carl. It's exactly as you said. This is not like the 4 factors that we decided to focus on first. These are not the final list of the variables. Definitely including or not including the family labor is one of the biggest discussion points that we have right now. And we will see how it goes with the further validation of the model.
Thank you. And any additional points you want to add, Rocco or Davide?
I don't have. I fully agree with what Carl said and Maria said. One point I would make is that well, there might have to be a lot of heterogeneity in the way we value this family labor across countries and potentially even within countries and region. And I think the answer really depends on whether these outside job opportunities are available or could be made available. And I can imagine the answer to that question to vary widely with respect to context and even to household members. But I think that the Enveritas data provide a great platform to start discussing those issues systematically and kind of ask questions, suppose that we were to value family labor so and so in a given locality, how much would the resulting profitability be compromised? And I think that this issue echoes other things. There is, of course, labor. The other factor that coffee is competing for on the farm, I guess, is land, because I suspect that a lot of the places where where yields are low is in part because the farmers are doing other things. And then the similar question that we have asked about family labor should be asked about what about these other crops and what are they for? Are they marketed? What is their opportunity cost and so forth? And again, the answer, I think, that on how do we value these alternative crops largely depends on how developed the markets in which these crops can be sold and why is it that the farmers are growing them. But I believe that this might be the object of another conversation, and I believe that again, even with regard to crops, the Enveritas data has the potential to offer, to guide some systematic insight.
Vern, let me quickly add that from the data, actually, we know that more than 60% of the farmers use coffee as a source of primary income. And so while there might be opportunities of the sector, I mean, most of these farmers that the Veritas surveys actually still mainly rely on coffee as a primary source for income.
Thanks. And I think that leads right into this other question that we're seeing here is from Doug Allen mentioning, looking at coffee productivity in isolation feels misleading He notes, for some unproductive farms, coffee productivity is low because it's a relatively unimportant part of the household's portfolio of activities. For instance, some households will have good off-farm opportunities that give them higher returns to labor than their coffee farms. Should we be surprised if they choose not to put much effort into coffee farming? And should we see that as a problem? Related to that, we shouldn't be looking at overall farm profitability and farm household well-being rather than coffee yield as a measure of interest. So that would be a question back to you all. As you think about the next steps in this analysis, how might you integrate that idea into essentially the outcomes we're looking at, and as we wrestle these very big and challenging, complex questions?
Sure, I'll take a venture first. I think that is one of the most important issues, because the world of coffee that we live in today is one where farmers did not choose their coffee. They have coffee. They were either trees were planted in some cases generations ago, but there wasn't a kind of thoughtful process of determining what is the right coffee to grow given the amount of land, the climate, the cost of production, the amount of time that you can put in. And so being able to expand the number of opportunities so that farmers have multiple ways of producing coffee, and there isn't any one single requirement, is going to change that. So you may have farms that want a variety which might be lower yielding, but is also much easier to manage. And then the other end, you have farmers that are going to want something where they can really maximize the yield, and that's going to require more work, more input in order to attain. A key thing that we're saying, I guess, if there's one takeaway, it will be that we shouldn't view there being a single cost of production for a farmer or for a country. It is a distribution, and that distribution is complex. There's many factors, and it is going to change over time based on actual decisions and external factors like what the market is doing. But I certainly think that there are going to be various ways that farmers can make a good margin and a good income from coffee. It isn't going to be one path for all farmers.
Excellent. And I wanted to just build on that point of the interannual point. Keith Fugli wrote in and asked, have you been able to look at annual variation in farm level coffee yield and profitability? It may be that a low productivity farm in 1 year may be closer to median or average, or median on average. What is your, could you just refresh our memory on the duration of the, how many years of data do you have, and do you see that year effect very strongly?
So we have several years now. So depending upon the country, it's either 2 to 4 years of data. It isn't longitudinal though, so it isn't going back to the same exact farm. So there's going to be some noise because of that. What I would say is that where there's some really interesting findings is in Brazil, because in Brazil you have farmers that are being very deliberate about trying to rejuvenate either their entire plot or a very specific portion, so that they can have some years where they have as little cost as possible and effectively zero production, and then in alternating years they have the maximum amount of production. And so those types of production systems are very different than what you see elsewhere in coffee, but is kind of in recognition of trying to minimize costs as much as possible some years, and then maximize yield as much as possible in other years, resulting in an average yield over a 2-year or 4-year period, which is still higher than what you might get, but is really optimized for cost of production.
Thanks. We have time for just maybe one more question. And I did want to note for all of those who have written in questions, we will compile all of the answers to these and send them back to you and make them available to the whole community who participated. So don't worry, if we don't get to your question here, we will absolutely get you a response in the coming week or two. Last question. So on the first conclusion slide, this is from Professor Victoria Salen. It stated that prices are not sensitive to changes in yield, at least at the local level. What is the evidence for this? Does the price data control for the influence of contract pricing or effectiveness of a national coffee board in affecting prices? Thought I would turn that one over to Davide or to Rocco.
Okay, seems that maybe I go for this if Davide doesn't want. No, these are a great question, and indeed it is the case that government or coffee boards intervene in very different ways in almost every single sourcing countries I'm aware of. So the results of the exercise that Davide has shown should be interpreted as kind of averages. On average, even if you increase, say, if you were able to increase yield by, say, 10%, you would have, at best, a very modest impact on the farm gate prices in the average locality. I believe that Davide has looked into heterogeneity across regions, and the results is kind of confirmed in the sense that, yes, there will be places where where there will be a little bit stronger impact and places where the impact will be more muted, but by and large, it's going to remain small. And if you think about it, this is kind of intuitive because so much of the, even for large countries, so much of the sector, I think, operates following sort of the world price, the world C price, that effectively in many localities, the demand curve is pretty horizontal, actually. So think about a country like Colombia with the Garancia de Compra, and then the price of the Garancia de Compra following very closely the coffee world C price. That C price, essentially, that is the reference price, is not going to be affected by whether Colombia improves or Nariño improves by 10% yields or not. And a fortiori, this will be true if you are thinking about places like Uganda, Rwanda, or rural areas of Ethiopia and so forth. There's a question of what would happen if you were to double the yields, whatever, in Brazil or in Vietnam. And I think that our analysis definitely doesn't mean to say that that would have a small impact on prices.
And if I may add to this, as far as I know, most of the government interventions on farm gate prices, and especially on setting minimum prices for coffee at the farm gate, are indicative, apart from Costa Rica and Colombia that Rocco just mentioned. And so these are not really enforced at the washing station level or at the farm level. So that's one other point, maybe because these are not very sensitive to changes in production and yields.
Thank you so much. We're going to quickly turn our attentions over to Rick Reinhardt, who is joining us to provide a synthesis and a summary as we head into this. And over to you, Rick.
Thank you, Vern, and thank you to Rocco and Davide and Maria and Carl, all of you, for really quite an extraordinary presentation. I was asked to offer some reflections on what this means to someone who's not had an academic interest in the topic so much as a pragmatic interest in the topic, and I'd say I have three sort of key reflections. The first one, which is, I would think, astoundingly obvious to everyone, is the reliance on intuitive approaches to development is really no longer tolerable. We've got to start to look at this from a standpoint of the rich data that's available to us, the analysis that's available to us, and to bring forward the questions that would further clarify the directions we ought to take in the development world. So I applaud this relatively small study and the fact of how revelatory it is of what we don't know, what we think we know, that we might have intuitively arrived at a conclusion that proves not to be true, and there are any number of them apparent in this study. The second thing that was quite striking for me, of course, and shouldn't be, but was this sense of heterogeneity amongst the sample populations against the outputs and outcomes from farms, not just on a national level or a local level, but really at the deepest possible level. So there's tremendous amount to be learned from reflecting on this heterogeneity and trying to get an academic approach, a data-driven approach, and some realistic interpretations and analysis of that data to help guide how we move forward. So to say that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution for the problems endemic in coffee and, in fact, in smallholder farming around the world in a variety of crops is the most sort of gross understatement. We will need a myriad of solutions to this, and I say that from two perspectives. From the perspective of someone actively working in development, we have to be extraordinarily thoughtful about testing a lot of solutions against the direction suggested by this kind of data and study. Equally, the folks who beat the free market drum must understand that that will also not be a one-size-fits-all solution for the issues that we face. And so, as rational and thoughtful human beings in the world, I think it's incumbent on us to sort of come together and try to design approaches that are varied, that are innovative, and that are most importantly based in the data we have at hand, and much less responsive to our intuitive analysis of the scenarios. And then the final piece that rose to the level of an interesting observation for me was so one of the sort of critical missing pieces, which is, what do we know about farmers' motivations in these varying scenarios? And it's a challenging one to answer, undoubtedly, and undoubtedly it's going to have a vast array of responses. And I think Carl did a good job of noting that, some of the farmer motivations here are baked into their reality, that they inherited a farm, they inherited trees, and from the standpoint of return on investment, even very low intensity coffee farming has fantastically good marginal returns because there's very little investment required to yield some cash from this existing investment. But we need to start to look at this in a different fashion. That is, what are the primary motivations for farmers to stay in farming, to exit farming, to intensify their farming, to de-intensify their farming? If they had access to capital, what decisions would they make? If they had better access to markets, what decisions would they make? If they had other alternatives on farm or off farm, what decisions would they make? And we get those answers by including farmers in the conversation. It's challenging to be sitting in this august company, looking across the panel of extraordinary minds that are attacking this problem from an academic perspective, and at the same time be an advocate for saying, hey, we need to talk to those who are closest to the ground on this and get their perspectives. But in the end of the day, I think any solutions that we try to impose or to bring to the market exclusively from the consuming side of the equation are going to be deeply, deeply flawed, regardless of the quality of our study, the quality of our data. So I am highly encouraged to seek ways to have more of a dialogue, to have a more inclusive input around not only the technical factors, but the motivating factors, the social factors, and the family and farm dynamics that influence how people make their decisions around farming. So I would just close by saying it's a very useful exercise. It's tremendous to have this much information, and I would encourage the research side of things to keep researching, the data collecting side of things to keep collecting, and more importantly, the interested observers in this conversation to increase their level of interest and their level of observation. And so if the increase in interest means finding ways to fund additional research, if it means finding ways to get engaged in the utilization of this research, if it means finding ways to pose those questions, both from the perspective of consumer and perspective of producer, then we should pursue those. But I look forward to more of these kinds of outcomes. I look forward to sharing this information with the folks I work with in a whole variety of ways, and see if we can't get better at how we design, implement, and execute the programs that we engage in an effort to increase the sustainability of smallholder agricultural production, the sustainability of coffee, and the sustainability of a range of other commodity products in our world. And so thanks for inviting me.
Finding the global leadership topics for 2022, and a survey will be forthcoming to the broader community, the membership. but we just want to make sure that we really do a good job with these webinars and bring information in ways that is actionable and insightful to you as you navigate this space. Also, we wanted to invite all of you to join us next week for the annual WCR Think and Drink for our report out on our activities over the past year and what's to come in 2022. You can register at the link on the side, or you can find it on our website. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us, and we look forward to your continued engagement and critical feedback on these programs. Thank you. Take care and have a great week.